Good evening, good day, and good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Berit Ebert. I'm the Vice President of Programs here at the American Academy, and I welcome everyone to this John W. Kluge lecture, The Language of Thieves, The Story of Rotwelsch and One Family's Secret History by Martin Puchner. Before I will talk a little bit about Martin, I would like to thank the John W. Kluge Foundation for endowing this distinguished visitorship, which enabled us to, well, under normal circumstances, bring Martin to the Academy. Now it's an online version, but we feel equally honored that you took the time, Martin. So a very warm welcome to you. Martin is actually a star, and so I had to shorten his extremely impressive biography to what you will hear now. He is the Byron and Anita Wien Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University, where he also serves as the founding director of the Mellon School of Theater and Performance Research. He completed his BA at the Universität Konstanz, his MA at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and at UC Irvine, and he received his PhD from Harvard University. A fellow of both the Guggenheim Foundation and the Coleman Center, he has published over a dozen books and anthologies, including the award-winning Poetry of Revolution, Marx Manifestos, and the Avant-Gardes, published with Princeton in 2006, as well as Drama of Ideas, Platonic Provocations in Theater and Philosophy, published with Oxford in 2010, which was awarded the Joe A. Colloway Prize and the Walter Channing Cabot Prize. Martin has also published The Written World, How Literature Shaped Civilization, published with Random House in 2017. John Sutherland writes in the New York Times of The Written World, and I quote, "There is a joyous personality in this book. Fieldwork for the written word takes Martin to every continent, digging inexhaustibly into cultures for their foundational and sacred stories. Martin Puchner's score on ratemyprofessors.com must be sky high. I suspect he is as enlightening at the lectern as on the page. As someone who has had the pleasure of experiencing Martin Puchner at the lectern, I can certainly confirm Sutherland's suspicion is absolutely right, and I think you're all in to a tremendous treat tonight, or today, or this morning. In addition to his monographs, Martin is the co-editor of Against Theater, Creative Destruction on the Modernist Stage, published with Palgrave in 2006, and the Northern Anthology of Drama in 2009. He is also the general editor of the Northern Anthology of World Literature. One could actually go on all night talking about Martin, his publications, his essays, his wonderful achievements and accomplishments in teaching and other things. But there is one very, very important accomplishment that I have to mention tonight, of course, and this is he was the spring 2019 Berkelund Fellow here at the American Academy, where we had the pleasure of experiencing his warmth and generosity as both a scholar and a person firsthand. Thank you, Martin. It was truly a wonderful time. At the Academy, Martin worked on a book project centered on his family's connection to the secret language of Rotwelsch, which was published by W.W. Norton as The Language of Thieves, My Family's Obsession with a Secret Code the Nazis Tried to Eliminate. I usually, some people who already know me and know my introductions know that I usually make some book recommendations at the end, at the beginning or at the end of talks. Here, of course, surprise, this is the book recommendation. If you haven't read it yet, you have to read it, and we will probably hear from it tonight. It's an excellent read. We're truly delighted that Martin agreed to join us again this evening to present for us the fruits of his work at the Academy. Since this publication in October 2020, the book received copious praise as, and I quote, "a fascinating blend of linguistics, history, and autobiography, which offers a powerful new approach to humanities research." This was by Bart van Es, the author of The Cutout Girl. And the New York Times Book Review writes, "a deeply personal project, one that probes the meaning of language and family, inheritance, and depth. Puchner's enthusiasm inspires illuminating detours into subjects like the history of Esperanto and the birth of simultaneous interpretation at the Nuremberg trials. What endures is his fascination with the resourcefulness and the resilience of generations of travelers, like the ones who came to his childhood home in Nuremberg, drawn by a hidden Zinken. And people who will not know or who don't know yet what Zinken is will soon know more about that. Academy alumnus Paul Reiter writes in our Berlin journal, in the language of thieves, Martin Puchner illuminates the topic of Rotwelsch with admirable insight and erudition, wielding his knowledge with a light touch. He does more than offer an account of dialect, or more precisely, sociolect. He also relates a fascinating family memoir whose mysteries circle around the Third Reich and the study of language. Puchner was born and raised in Bavaria, tracks his own family's elusive history through the philological activities and obsessions of his uncle, great uncle, and grandfather. I have to stop with the praise here. I will in a minute turn over the virtual lectern to Martin so that you can actually experience firsthand his excellent work. After the lecture, and here is the good news, Martin will not en Hasen machen. We know after the book, after having read the book, that this means making a quick escape, but he will stay on and we will take your questions and I will post them to Martin. And I would also already now, not really now, but let him talk a bit, but during the lecture, you can already ask your questions via the Q&A function, which is on the bottom right of your screen. There is also a little yellow raise hand function. This doesn't work tonight. You can use it. It will do simply nothing. Please use the Q&A function for asking your questions. Martin, it's an honor to have you here with us. Welcome back again. And the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Berit, for this lovely introduction and for the Academy first to have given me the opportunity to finish the book there, and now to report on it. And thank you everyone who is tuning in. I know that there are many old friends and colleagues, and it would be so great to see you in person. I think you can see me, I can see you, but I'm really looking forward to interacting with you in the Q&A, which is why I only want to talk about 30 minutes, because I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and having a live, if remote, interaction with you. And as Berit indicated, this is a research project that has occupied me for a long time about Rotwelsch, the secret language of vagrants in Central Europe from the Middle Ages into the 20th and even 21st century. But it is also a personal history. And in the book, I try to intertwine these two stories, and I'm going to do that tonight as well. And that means really starting with my introduction to this language, which happened very early on. It's, in fact, one of my first childhood memories are connected to this language, not to the spoken version of the language, but to the signs that are associated with it, that Zinken Berit just mentioned. So some of my earliest memories, as I mentioned, is of vagrants showing up at my childhood home. This is not an actual image of my childhood home. It's one, but it's a archival image of a Zinken, an American Zinken actually, which, as you will hear, are the same as the Rotwelsch Zinken. A sign like this, a little more discreet, that drew vagrants to my childhood home, and my mother would give them a sandwich and something to drink, and then they would leave, and I would observe this happen again and again until I learned that about the sign that this signaled to them, the sign that you see here, that bread was to be had at this home. And this is how I learned about these mysterious runes. And there were many. There are about sort of 50 runes like this one, signs Zinken like this one. But there were even more. There were sort of more complicated personal signs, almost individual signatures, and sometimes even little stories that were carved into trees or chalked onto foundation stones. Let's, for example, look at this one. This is a sign from the 19th century left behind by a vagrant who goes by the initials of MH, who says that it's actually a group of vagrants who came by here in 1832. It's a little hard to see. A group composed out of 2 men, the 2 down strokes, and 3 zeros, which can mean either 3 women or 3 children, going in the direction of the error. Here's another documentary image of a vagrant carving a similarly complicated series of runes into a house. And for those of you who watched Mad Men, the television series Mad Men, you may remember a scene from the first season when the Madison Avenue executive Don Draper, when we're taken to his childhood home, he grows up on a farm during the Great Depression with his evil stepdad. A vagrant comes by, works for a quarter and a night's accommodation. After having worked, next morning, this evil stepdad cheats the hobo out of the quarter, and the hobo leaves in anger. Young Don Draper follows him and watches him carve that sign into a tree, which means a bad person lives here. Don't trust that person. And I immediately recognized that sign from the show, because it's also the same in these Rotwelsch Zinken that clearly made it to America. So that was my introduction to this world of these written signs. And we've used the word Zinken, which comes actually from the Latin for signum, for sign. So these written signs. So that's one aspect of the language. But then there's, of course, the spoken language. And this too, I was introduced to as a child. It's something I took for granted at the time. And later I started to wonder why. But as a child, again, my childhood memories is that I loved this language because it seemed so fun. So for example, stinker was a barn. Holzwurm was a word for carpenter. So it seemed like a kind of fun language in which earthy and witty, with sort of twisted words that change their meaning. And as you can imagine, for a child, that's great fun. But it wasn't just these kind of simple terms or expressions. I was, for example, this is how I was introduced to Shakespeare. This is from the balcony scene of Romeo and Juliet. Dear Romeo, swear not by the moon, the constant moon that monthly changes in our circled orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable. Wonderful, wonderful Shakespeare, except when I was introduced to Shakespeare, it sounded more like this. Hippiger Romeo, o gable lau beim Bleck dem Überbeuter, der Merwig seinen Radling wabert, damit den Rauch dein Lenzen waberbar. Also sounds pretty nice, but it's a little hard to know what it means if you don't know Rotwelsch. So let's look at this actually a little bit, and it gives you a sense of how this language functions. So as you'll have noticed, these grammatical terms that I highlighted here are German. And that's because the grammar of Rotwelsch is German. It's a German grammar, which is why technically, linguistically speaking, it's not a full language, but a sociolect, the idiom of a distinct group or profession. So the grammar is provided by German, but most of the meaning-bearing terms are difficult to understand. Where do they come from? So hippiker comes from Yiddish, chiba, deer, hippiker, Romeo. Ogable, swear. That's an interesting one. It comes from German, the German word for gabel. Only here it means, it's become a verb, and it means to swear, because the prongs of a fork, when you swear, they looks like a fork. So here it means to, so this term fork has been used into a verb to swear, or swear not by the moon, or gable lau beim Bleck. So Bleck comes from Yiddish, but it's also connected to German, Blech for tin. It can mean coin, tin coin, except in Rotwelsch, it means moon, the tin coin up in the sky. So, another example of the kind of, I don't know, sort of earthiness of this language, that something as romantic and poetic as the moon is described with something as everyday as a tin coin. So this is how this language works. It draws from German, Yiddish, Hebrew via Yiddish, Hebrew, but also German dialect terms, Czech, Romani, this language of Sinti and Roma, and other languages, and changes their meaning. Okay, so this is Rotwelsch, and this was, as I mentioned, my introduction to it. Now, why was I introduced to this language? My parents were not part of the itinerant underground. The main reason was my uncle. My uncle was sort of a bohemian figure, a composer, a musician-composer, and poet. And he, at some point, became obsessed with Rotwelsch, and he is the one, primarily, my father also to some extent, who introduced me to Rotwelsch. He's, for example, the one who translated this passage from Shakespeare into Rotwelsch. He's the one who deciphered the sign that's sinken, that drew vagrants to my childhood home. And he was really for me the center of all things Rotwelsch. He, as I mentioned, basically dedicated his entire life to this language. He collected terms and expressions, card catalogs upon card catalogs of terms. And he embarked on this incredible sort of lifelong translation project that he published some of that. This is one of his books, where he took parts of world literature, including Shakespeare and the Bible and a lot more, and translated it into Rotwelsch, and actually found a publisher to publish it. So he was really the person who introduced me as a child to Zinken and Rotwelsch. And as you can imagine, I loved it as a child. It seemed fun. It seemed cool that I knew something about the secret language that no one else really knew much about. And so that's really the first act here of this drama, and as how I got introduced to the language without knowing much about it. And so then the second act starts with a different scene. It starts in this wonderful library. This is the reading room of Widener Library at Harvard. And I'm here as a student, a graduate student. I'm writing my dissertation. And people keep saying what a fantastic library Widener Library is. One of the greatest libraries in the world, one of the largest, with the largest holdings. And so I'm sitting in this library. Rotwelsch has more or less drifted into the background. I occasionally tell my friends about it, but it's drifted into the background. But here I'm in the library. I'm supposed to write my dissertation. And of course, I'm procrastinating. And I'm thinking, what can I do? And I'm thinking, people keep bragging about how good this library is. I'm gonna test this library. And so I think of my uncle, and I think I'm gonna check whether they have his Rotwelsch book. I mean, this obscure, crazy project of translating world literature into Rotwelsch. And so I go, and they have this book, and I'm amazed. Widener is really a great library. And then I said, okay, I'm going to test it again. I'm going to see whether they have any of my grandfather's writings. My grandfather was an archivist and a historian of names. It always seemed to me a kind of slightly obscure topic, mostly place names and names of monasteries, patron saints, and so on and so forth. Very dry stuff to my mind, even though I was sort of interested in literature. So I go to the card catalog. This is in the early to mid 90s. And when there were still card catalogs, and I'll look him up, and indeed Widener has some of his very obscure works, collections of sources on monasteries in southern Bavaria and materials like that. But then I look around a little more, and I come across this article, Familiennamen als Rassenmerkmal, Dr. Karl Puchner. And I begin to sort of read it. I'm a little startled by the title. And as I read more of this article, I'm increasingly shocked because it's from 1934 and it's an incredible anti-Semitic rant. And I have childhood memories of my grandfather. He seemed sort of a wonderful person, sometimes slightly irascible, but I knew nothing of his past except that he'd been in the war and that, you know, he'd been an archivist. And here he writes about Jewish names and German names and how it's very difficult to tell Jewish names from German names, and it's a big mess, and Jews are deceptive and they use the camouflage names and you can't be too careful. And it's this really horrible anti-Semitic, hateful treatise on names. And he demands that a registry of Jewish names be instituted, and a lot of the things that then through the Nuremberg laws and other laws were actually instituted. He was not important, but he was clearly aligned with this anti-Semitic Nazi project. So I was completely shocked. But I was also puzzled because in the middle of this article, he writes about Rotwelsch, the language that my father and especially my uncle loved, and in my uncle's case had dedicated his life to rescuing, to promoting with his translation project, with teaching me this language. So here in this article, my grandfather rants against Rotwelsch and uses Rotwelsch as a proof. Here you can see how deceptive these Jews are, because they have turned Yiddish into this criminal language, and it's a Jewish language, which just proves what every anti-Semite has been thinking all along, namely that all Jews are criminals and it's all a big mess, and we have to drain the swamp, as he put it. So here I'm sitting here and I'm doubly shocked. I was shocked to discover that my grandfather was clearly an anti-Semite who'd made common cause with the Nazis, and this strange puzzle that the language which I had been taught to love, that my grandfather also knew about it and had studied it, but hated it. So how come that his two sons made it their mission to rescuing this language? What did this all mean? And so this is really when in 1995, when for me this research project began, really a double research project. On the one hand, trying to understand how what went on with my grandfather and his sons, and how come that now, including me, 3 generations are somehow entangled with this strange, obscure language. And B, I also realized from reading this attack on Rotwelsch that even though I sort of had grown up around it and to some extent with it, that I knew next to nothing about it. So I didn't know, was my grandfather right in saying this was a criminal language, and what was its origin? So that's when I began to study Rotwelsch in earnest. And I was surprised what I found. I learned how old it was, that it started in the Middle Ages, and I started to study some of these sources. And the sources, I should say, mostly came from the archive that my uncle assembled. So my uncle died early of a brain aneurysm in his 40s. And when I started, after my discovery, I went to my aunt and got his archive and have been carrying that around with me for now over 25 years. And it's from that archive that I started to, and then added more sources to it, that I reconstructed the strange history of this language and its sources. So apart from these particular Zinken that I started with, the language really was a purely spoken language. It was never really written down, which makes it very hard to track and to know anything about. But I should add, it was not written down by its speakers. It was written down by others. And one of the first to write down this language was this gentleman. Why would Martin Luther bother with Rotwelsch? Well, he, of course, knew Hebrew because it's translating the Old Testament, and he cares a lot about German, which he helps to shape modern German. So, and we also know that he is a pretty clear anti-Semite of some description. So all of these features, his knowledge of Hebrew, his anti-Semitic attitude, and his campaign for a kind of reform of German lead him to become obsessed with Rotwelsch. The form this takes from Martin Luther is a book that he doesn't write, that existed before him. The Liber Vagatorum, also known von der falschen Bettlerbüberei, but he republishes this book with a new preface. And it's a book that warns upright citizens about the different deceptive practices of vagrants and beggars, and with the intention of stopping those and giving those in authority the ability to stop vagrancy and begging. Luther also hated beggars because he felt like that they weren't productive workers, they were sort of parasites on society. One reason why he hated mendicants, because he felt like they were just sponging off society. So in the back of this book, though, he adds about 250 Rotwelsch words. You can also, if you can read that strange script, you'll see that von hinten an ein Rotwelsch Vocabularius. So he adds these Rotwelsch terms. It's one of the first to name this language, so that people can understand these deceptive beggars. So it's here that I also finally learned where that word comes from. So rot doesn't mean red, it means beggar in that language. And Welsh doesn't mean Welsh, it means incomprehensible. It can also mean Italian, but here it really means incomprehensible. So that means the incomprehensible, the beggars can't, the incomprehensible language of beggars. So that's the word, a pejorative term used mostly. There's a second term for the language, used less commonly, but sometimes, and that's Hebrew derived, kachemer, from the Hebrew word for wise, and Laschen, the Hebrew term for tongue or language. So the language of the wise, I know that, I love this term, the language of those in the know. Okay, so that's the beginning then of this research project that really becomes sort of, leads me deep into the itinerant underground of Central Europe. And some of these figures that emerge from it are quite fascinating figures. One of them is Konstanzer Hans, who is sort of a Robin Hood figure who steals from the rich and sort of becomes sort of a local hero. These figures are also then connected to how this language was written down, besides by people like Martin Luther. And that means mostly by the police. Almost the entire written archive of Rotwelsch was produced by the enemies of this language, mostly the police. When they would apprehend a figure like Konstanzer Hans, they would, and realize that they were speakers of this language, they would force them to reveal terms and increase the police's knowledge of this underground language, because they felt like vagrants and thieves had concocted this language for the specific purpose of evading the police. This is kind of a paranoid, isn't quite true, but that's what they felt. And that means that this archive that I inherited from my uncle contained basically was the fruit of the work of these policemen who cross-examined and questioned and apprehended these speakers. I say that the language was never written down by any of its speakers, but there is one really interesting exception, and that is a vagrant from the 19th century, Ferdinand Baumhauer, who, in this, again, typical scene, he's arrested. The police realize that he's a Rotwelsch speaker, so they immediately question him about words to know more about this language. But they realize that they're very lucky because Ferdinand Baumhauer not only is a Rotwelsch speaker, he also has a good hand because he knows how to read and write, because for his sort of niche in the ecosystem of the underground is to forge passports and papers. And so what the police do is they sit him down and say, write scenes from the underground. And he writes for weeks. He produces like 100 pages, 2 volumes, thick volumes like that. The police. This is in the police archive of Jena. And they tell him, you write these scenes in Rotwelsch and you provide us on the right-hand side, you can see with the vocabulary list. So this is the only written source written by a Rotwelsch speaker in Rotwelsch under duress for the police. So it's sort of a strangely tainted and suspicious document, but nevertheless a fascinating one that lets us understand this language. And then a final figure I want to mention, here we're now in the 20th century, is Gregor Gog, who's trying to organize vagrants into some kind of group. He creates a newspaper, Der Kunde, and because of this sort of prominent role, he's sometimes called the king of the tramps. This also gets him into trouble because Rotwelsch speakers were also always persecuted, as you can tell from the importance of the police for this archive. But of course, this persecution of Rotwelsch speakers became particularly extreme during the Nazi era. Vagrants were one of the first to be sent to concentration camps, including Gregor Gog. He managed to escape to the Soviet Union, where he died after the war. But this is that history of persecution that includes Gregor Gog, sort of one of the more colorful Rotwelsch speakers. So this is the milieu in which it is spoken, but it's also the case that other people, especially people interested in language, became aware of Rotwelsch and became fascinated by it, much the way my uncle would a little later. So one of them is Franz Kafka. In his lecture on Yiddish, as some of you may know, Kafka, of course, grew up in the Jewish bourgeoisie of Prague, German-speaking, that milieu looked down on Yiddish speakers, but Kafka fell in love with a troupe of Yiddish players and sort of became their unofficial promoter. And so he would give this speech trying to convince mostly the Jewish bourgeoisie of Prague to go to Yiddish theater. And he described Yiddish as this kind of mobile language that had taken German words and changed their meaning. And in the course of that, he talks about Rotwelsch as a sort of more extreme version, and talks about it almost as a kind of literary resource, because it's sort of a mobile language. It's an estranged language. Another figure who came across Rotwelsch much earlier was Leibniz, who's now most important contribution perhaps is to be, sometimes he's considered the father of computer languages, of artificial languages, and he came across Rotwelsch as an artificial language. It's not quite true, but because it was always seen as this secret code concocted by thieves, it was seen as a secret language, and sometimes pops up in sort of treatises on codes and deciphered speech and so on and so forth. So this is how Leibniz came across it. And finally, Ludwik Zamenhof, the founder of Esperanto, of course, created an actual artificial language, unlike Rotwelsch, which wasn't a real artificial language. But this language was sometimes compared to Esperanto because it too was sort of a combination of different languages, and as I said, concocted as an artificial language. So a very obscure language written down by the police that radiated outward and drew all kinds of people into its orbit, including my uncle, but also these figures. So that's the main story of Rotwelsch, if you will. But I just want to spend maybe 5 more minutes to close the loop on the personal story, because as you'll remember, we left it with my discovery of my grandfather's writings in Widener Library. This is an image of him, and so this has, of course, been sort of weighing on me as I educated myself about the history of Rotwelsch, and I always thought I need to learn more about my grandfather, how he came to write that hateful article. So finally, I go to his place of work after the war, the Bavarian State Archive, here with that horse in front of it. And I go there, and they have a huge file on my grandfather because he became the director of this archive after the war. And so I studied that file, and I was shocked because his entire dark past was preserved in that personnel file, including his early party membership. And all of this was completely unknown to the family. His early party membership, he joins the party in 1930, he becomes a member of the stormtroopers. All of this before the war, and then sort of clearly makes common cause with the Nazis, and is clearly in some ways and a relatively early adopter, has a relatively low party number. So that is, that deepens, of course, my shock, but also explains why he came to write down this article. So that's part of that family research. But then I also looked at his brother, who also became an archivist, and who ended up the director of the Nuremberg State Archive. And I looked into his history, and it's quite similar to that of his brother. He also became a member of the Nazi Party. He also became had this wonderful career in post-war Germany as an archivist. And to what did he owe his career? He owed his career as an archivist in Nuremberg to the Nuremberg trials. He became one of the experts on the Nuremberg trials, kind of an irony, but of course not an atypical one. These two Nazis making careers in post-war Germany, sitting on their personnel files that they preserved those files. So in that sense, they were both committed archivists. But here in this case in particular, owing his career to the files preserved in the Nuremberg trial. So that is that difficult family history that is part of it, that leads me to conclude, even though I can't prove it, that somehow the next generation's obsession with Rotwelsch, my father and my uncles, somehow must have had to do with having some understanding of what the previous generation did, and making that commitment to rescuing that language their grandfather tried to eliminate, and rescuing that as some form of atonement. That's sort of the conclusion I have come to, and in some way, I suppose in a small way, I'm continuing this work. And so I've been actually just working with a translator on the German version of this book, which is going to come out in the fall. And I'm, of course, looking forward to that, because it's, I feel like it's an important story to tell in Germany.
I don't really know where to start. I have quite a lot of questions, and they of course mainly relate to the two components of your book. And on the one hand, your book is extremely personal and open, and on the other hand, it's this truly thorough history of Rotwelsch. Let me perhaps start with the comment where you ended, talking about your grandfather and how this traced through your family history. You also write in your book, of course, it took quite a while for you to discover your grandfather's article. What happened then? How did, that must have, that was a decisive moment? Did you talk to your father about it? Did you talk to your uncle about it? Did they have any interaction with your grandfather before? Then you must have been extremely curious about a certain period of family history here.
Yeah, no, I was, and it's a part, I left that out of the presentation, but I'm glad you asked. So yes, of course, the first thing I do, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I make this discovery. And so shortly thereafter, a few weeks, or don't quite remember, my father came to visit. He was touring the US with a group of students. He was an architect and taught architecture. And he came by and visited me, and of course I immediately asked him, how come do you know about this? How come, what's happening here? Why do I not know anything about that? I'm in my mid-20s at this point. And it was a difficult conversation. And in that conversation, he told me a story that he had never told me before. He said, never knew about these articles. He was shocked, but he said that I had an inkling that there was something buried in the past, because when he in 68, I think it was, my father got a kind of photography kit to develop his own images, and he asked his mother to send him old family pictures for kind of a Christmas calendar or something like that. And he develops one of these images, and as the image is getting sharp, comes into view, he sees it's an image from 1937, and he sees that his father is sitting there, and that he's wearing a swastika button. And why is he doing that? And so he confronts his father, both he and my brother, and it becomes a big family scene. Very typical in Germany in 68. Sort of, it's the 68 generation finally reckoning with that history. And shouting matches, but the grandfather says, "You don't know, we had to do this, whatever." And then that story gets buried again. So it's that's where the book, in my mind, became not just a book about a secret language, but also about family secrets, how they're kind of sort of half uncovered and then buried again. And then I have to come along and discover that in some sense all over again. So that was that first conversation with my father. But it was actually, sadly, also my last conversation with my father, because he, a few months later, died of a sailing accident, and by this point his brother was also long dead. So in some sense, I'm glad I had that one conversation, but yeah. So the two people who would know the most, namely my uncle and my father, were no longer there. So hence the attempt to reconstruct and understand this history through conversations with other family members and this archive.
Yeah, which you excellently did. And yeah, of course, Uncle Günther played a huge role here. There is also a Tante Heidi.
Yes.
And I was wondering, we heard a lot about male individuals and Rotwelsch. Is there? Can you say a little bit more about the female connection and the female interaction?
Yeah. And again, I'm glad you asked, because initially it seemed to me very much a story about the fathers and sons and grandsons, and a kind of a male story. And most of the sort of well-known figures like Konstanzer Hans and Baumhauer are also male. So it sounds like it's a very male world. And I realized in my presentation it also is a very male world. And as I'm in the middle of this project, I start to wonder about this. Is that the case? Is it really a male world? Both the Rotwelsch world and this family history. And I realized that that's actually not quite the case, that I start to look in, not so much in my uncle's archive, but in other sources, and I actually find that this Rotwelsch speakers, there were many women, and I reconstruct as one can from these scraps of information, fascinating female stories about female vagrants and their role. And also the the role of women in the family, both my aunt who helps my uncle actually create some of these Rotwelsch dictionaries, to my mother's history and her family history. And so yes, it's not I had to sort of look for the evidence. What stood out primarily were these male stories, but once I made an effort and looked for the female stories, they were also very clearly there.
Yeah, thank you. Coming back to one of the male individuals in the story, and I truly enjoyed the chapter you wrote about Martin Luther. So Martin Luther, you refer to him as saying Rotwelsch comes from the Jews. And then you, at some point in the chapter, you say, actually, Martin Luther can be considered one of the first modern populists. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. This is, I guess, actually something that goes back to my last book, where I thought a lot about writing technologies and media, if you will, sort of the prehistory of the internet, if you will. And yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not even such an original claim. I'm not the first one to, I think, claim it, though maybe I put it more pointedly than others. It has simply to do with the fact that clearly Martin Luther would not be Martin Luther without his day's media revolution, I mean, the revolution of print. He was the first really to use print for populist purposes. I mean, you can use, I mean, I guess there's a sort of slightly negative connotation here, but to circumvent power structures, the courts, the church. It wasn't, initially Luther wasn't interested in it himself. It was mostly his friends and associates. After he, published the theses, or like distributed the theses written in Latin. I mean, this is not popular material, but said, we should use these printing presses that are starting out. And why don't you write in German? And then it really takes off, and he dominates print output in Germany. About a third of all printed materials during his lifetime is written by Martin Luther. So it is very much a media revolution that's happening, and that I think it's quite comparable in some ways to the internet. Again, I'm not the first one to point this out, but that's what stood behind that maybe snide comment or short comment.
Yeah, thank you. You alluded to the internet and to the present, which brings me to my next question, which is also similar to a question we have here from the audience. What is, that can be probably summarized with, what is the status of the language now? Is it, I love the question here, is it still being spoken by someone other than you?
Yes. Yeah, no.
Give us the numbers here.
It's a great question. And I get, actually, that question brings me back to the American Academy. Because I was asking myself this question, and sometimes in a maybe kind of sort of heroic post-thought of myself as the last speaker, but that's not the case. And the way I learned about this, and that provided me with my last chapter, was when a journalist, while I was at the American Academy, in fact, wrote an article about this project of mine. For the Taz. And then after that was published, all kinds of people started to email me about sightings of Rotwelsch or something that they knew about Rotwelsch, including someone from the French-speaking part of Switzerland who said that he, for complicated family history reasons of his own, was in touch with a group of itinerants in Switzerland who spoke Yiddish, which is sort of a successor language to Rotwelsch, also an itinerant language that has actually quite a few Rotwelsch terms in it. And through him, as an intermediary, I was able to establish contact with this group and was able to confirm that in some ways, at least, some Rotwelsch terms still exist in that language, in that lifestyle. So for the longest time, I thought that it was a dead language, but it's not. And it is a language of survival at the margins, and it still exists.
Great, which brings me again to one of my advertising parts here. I wanted to mention this in the introduction and I actually forgot, but everyone who buys this book, and this is truly wonderful about this book, at the end of every chapter, Martin has a little vocabulary list that you can actually learn. And this is really great. I love this about the book. But in relation to the previous questions, I have another question. What is the geographical span or spread of Rotwelsch? And was there a special Jewish role in the expansion of Rotwelsch?
Yeah. So the territory is, since the host language, so to speak, is German, it was mostly spoken in the German-speaking part of Central Europe. But expands so sort of from the Rhine to Prague, I would say, though there would be regional variants. Though it also became kind of a lingua franca because dialect differences among these groups are quite extreme, though Rotwelsch was a much more mobile language, and that's in some sense the interesting connection to Esperanto. I started to, think of it almost as a kind of Esperanto of the underworld. But as I said, the geographic area is mostly German-speaking part of Central Europe. Now, as for the Jewish role, it was one of the most difficult questions to answer, because the archive, from Martin Luther to my grandfather, clearly said this is a Jewish language. It's a criminal Jewish language, and this is what everyone said. But once I started to actually reconstruct the histories of some of these speakers, I mean, a small subset, of course, none of them were Jewish. And it became clear that the Rotwelsch was not an ethnically defined language; it was a milieu. Once you drifted into the itinerant milieu, no matter what your background or what religious or ethnic background, you were sort of inducted into this language. So it was not an ethnically identified language, contrary to what most of the archival sources. I realized I had to read the archive against the grain to some extent. And yet the question remains, why is there so much Yiddish and Hebrew in this language? And one can only speculate. But it's of course true that to some extent Yiddish was also a migratory language. There were Jewish peddlers and so-called Betteljuden. And it was a language that was German and not German, and sort of lent itself perhaps as a kind of source for Rotwelsch, as one source among many, maybe more dominant than Czech, or there's also a little bit of Latin because of traveling students in this language. So it's really this hodgepodge. But there is a Yiddish and Hebrew strain in it. It is quite prominent, and that's fascinating to think about. But in the end, I would say that it's a language that's not ethnically or religiously defined, but defined really by milieu, which is why linguists would call it a sociolect, or I like that too, a professional language.
Do we know more about how the language traveled to the United States? You indicated this in the beginning of your talk.
So the language itself barely traveled to the United States. There are some expressions among the sort of Jewish gangs of New York or other gangs of New York that are similar, but it's unclear whether there's a direct influence. For example, school for prison. This is something that was very common in Rotwelsch, but I think there's a lot of reasons as a kind of ironic term for the underworld. And Jewish gangs of New York also, of course, have Hebrew and Yiddish expressions in them that also exist in Rotwelsch, but it's unclear whether it came to New York via Rotwelsch or just via the common Yiddish and Hebrew source, probably the latter. But what definitely came to the United States are these zinken, these written signs that became quite prominent in the United States during the Great Depression. They're mostly called hobo signs. And my uncle was also onto this. He collected some books on hobo signs as well. And so this written code and there's a large overlap between hobo signs and Rotwelsch signs. So they clearly traveled, and because they are not tied to language, it's not phonetic, they of course could be adopted much more easily in a mostly English-speaking or multilingual US context. So those signs definitely traveled. Rotwelsch, maybe just a few expressions.
All right. Here is another question relating to the title of your book. In English, you use the word thieves.
Yes.
The German book title, the question says, avoids this word. Is your English book title a little derogatory?
We struggled with this. I mean it sort of in quotation marks, so to speak. I mean, it's the language that was always called the language of thieves, or language of thieves. But that it's very true. It's a derogatory term, and the book, in some sense, argues against that. And it was a bit of a risk. Am I perpetuating that idea? And I think in retrospect, I felt that maybe that it was a little bit too risky, a little bit, how do the quotation marks come across in a title? So this is why we debated this for a long time and decided in the German not to take that risk. But for the, my New York publisher felt like it was more of a provocation, and I guess they wanted the provocation.
Okay, yeah, okay, understood. Thank you so much. One very close academy friend and still Berliner, Veronika Puchner, is asking a question, and actually asks an excellent question which summarizes several others. First of all, she says, fantastic lecture, thank you. Thank you, Veronika. And she asks, could you say more about the connection with Romani and the cultures of Sinti and Roma?
So I should say that, thank you, Vero. Vero is so nice saying these nice things about the lecture only because she knows that I saw her perform in a cabaret about 30 years ago, and I could tell a lot of stories about that. So I think she's trying to placate me. Nevertheless, thank you, Vero. It's a great question. So I talked about how the language is not ethnically defined, but defined by milieu, or a kind of lifestyle, you could say. And that lifestyle, the itinerant life, is, of course, in many ways similar to that of the Sinti and Roma. So there was a kind of definitely a shared life of the road, which is why there are Romani words in Rotwelsch, but not the other way around, because the Sinti and Roma, of course, are in a complicated way linguistically, or in some sense ethnically defined. They were more of a closed society, perhaps, or certainly with a society with a clear sense of a self-identity. And so this is why I think the influence mostly, as far as I can tell, went in one direction, not in both directions. But nevertheless, that there was this influence, albeit one going in one direction, showed that there was definitely overlap. I would say a shared life of the road, though. I became very interested in these parallel cases. In one case, a group or groups with a clear sense of self-identity that can be variously described by inherited ethnic identities or linguistic identities, as well as external pressure of history of persecution, of course. And on the other hand, in the case of Rotwelsch, a much more heterogeneous and in some sense accidental or purely milieu or professionally version of that life, and a language that in some sense mirrors or mirrors that life by being cobbled together from all of these different sources. The members of that surviving group describe them as recycling words from languages, and that's not true. I mean, all languages recycle words, of course, in some basic sense, but that would not be true of Sinti and Roma. So great, thank you, Vero, for this question.
Thank you for the answer. I would have, of course, a lot of questions about Vero now, but I will not ask them.
Because Vero was so nice, I will not reveal anything.
Yeah, we will not go any further here. Another question about your personal story to the book. Is it significant that the story had to travel through the US and to come back to Germany?
Yeah, from Michel Shauli, another old friend and former teacher of mine. Thank you, Michelle, for this question. And I think the answer is yes. I do think that my having removed myself in some sense from Germany, or emigrated to the United States, and looking back at that history, I think that definitely, in any case, if I'd stayed in Germany, I may not have written it, or it would have become a very different book. And this also, I think, on the level of language, I was really debating with myself whether I should write it in German. In many ways, I think that would have made sense, since German is the host language of Rotwelsch and so on and so forth. But in the end, I mean, also for pragmatic reasons to some extent, but I felt that it was good for me to write it in English, to have, again, some kind of linguistic distance, if you will, to look back, to have a perspective on this history, both the personal history and the capital H history. So yes, and I write a little bit about that. So I think yes, I think it's true that the book, I mean, it's also, I've now spent more than half my life in the United States. I mean, I have very close and continuing ties to Germany, of course, but it's a way of looking back and thinking about that inheritance. And I think that was, in some sense, also occasioned by having emigrated. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I don't have any secret stories to reveal about Michel. So
here's another, but here is indeed a question about secret stories. Did the writings that you discovered had any double meaning? Did you discover any secret stories?
It's an interesting question. I mean, as I indicated, I felt that that the sources, which were all written down by the police, that they didn't maybe have exactly double meaning, but they were a little bit, I had to distrust them, including the one wonderful written source by Ferdinand Baumhauer, because yes, it's great because it's the only way we know sort of how the language works in action in the 19th century. So it seems like a great source, and it is, but it's also clearly one that is written for the police under duress, and it's the case that he clearly is also trying to placate the police, and maybe he's telling the police what they want to know, what they want to hear, and in some sense it works, because they, after spending weeks in some room writing these stories, they are plays. He really gets into it, like with stage directions. And I mean, I don't think anyone ever performed these plays, but these Rotwelsch plays. But the police relax their vigilance, and he manages to escape. So you could also, I mean, you could, in some sense, say this was all a big con to get out of prison. I mean, I wouldn't go quite as far, but it's that suspicion. So that all of these sources, from Martin Luther to Baumhauer, there's I would call it reading it against the grain, reading it with a certain suspicion, remembering the context in which these documents were produced and preserved. All of this, it's another way of saying this. This became a book very much about archives and archivists, and both professional archivists like my uncle and his brother, hobby archivists like my uncle, who's creating sort of a counter archive, and just thinking about the conditions under which something ends up in an archive. Yeah.
And in terms of quantity and perhaps also geographical outreach, and here's a question about the other sources that were sympathetic to Rotwelsch, other than your uncle. Was there a lot material? How do we have to imagine that? Because I'm also asking this because when we spoke before, you said, and I don't want to put pressure on you, but I do. You said that you are thinking about publishing another book about this, and of course we would all like to read this. So I'm wondering what is.
Oh, I was partially jesting, actually. I don't know whether
Okay.
I have the stomach for another one.
Seriously.
No, it was a hard and sometimes grueling thing to write. Though I'm glad I did it. There are some sympathetic sources. There's one particular interesting one, another 19th century figure, a police commissioner, Ave Lallemann, from Hamburg, from originally a French family, who becomes very interested in Rotwelsch. And I mean, he still writes as a policeman, but he takes a kind of a sociological approach to the criminal, as he thinks of it, as the criminal underground. And it's in that way that he starts to really analyze Rotwelsch. It's the first sort of quasi-scientific study of Rotwelsch, and there aren't many. And so, for example, including, to come back to Vero's question about Sinti and Roma, he realizes that this isn't just a Jewish language, and that it comes from all these other languages. And then, so he befriends a Roma woman, and with her help tracks down the Romani influence in Rotwelsch. So he is, I would say, he's at least not an overtly prejudiced. He's also kind of a police reformer. He's a very interesting figure, and I would say one of the more sympathetic, or at least he tries to embody a kind of scientific ethos, and not just use this to feed a kind of anti-Semitic imagination. Oh, sorry. So there are occasional occasional sympathetic figures like that, though there are in the great minority. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think time is, we're slowly running out of time. There are a few other questions, but some of them would be answered if you would all read the book, of course. And I will try to pass on those questions to Martin, and perhaps we can answer them via email. So thank you so much, Martin, for a fascinating lecture. Thank you everyone for incredibly excellent questions. And if you would all like to, we could all, not me, but tomorrow you would see Daniel Benjamin with our Kurt Viermetz lecture, Unpacking Biden's Environmental Agenda by Todd Stern, who was the United States chief negotiator of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you again, Martin. Come to Germany as soon as you can. You're always warmly invited to stop by.
Thank you so much, Berit, and to the Academy, and to everyone who, in this period of Zoom fatigue, was part of the. I was reading even the questions I couldn't answer, and I so many friends. It's great to know that you're here, and hopefully soon in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.